Welcome. Thanks for joining. It's gonna take a few more minutes for folks to join in. And for those of you that are already here, love to know where you are logging in from. So enter that in the chat if you like and say hello. Great. I'm looking at the chat here. We have folks coming from Saskatoon, Detroit, and Houston. Another folk from Vancouver. We have quite a few participants from Canada this time around, which is great. Welcome, welcome. We're just gonna give a few more minutes, then we'll get started. All right, welcome. Thank you all for attending today. We are thrilled to have you join us for today's webinar. My name is Ellie Kim. I'm a senior consultant with Alberta Health Services, and I also serve the ARMA International Board as a director. I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to thank our ARMA members for joining us today. From online education and industry opportunities, we encourage you to connect and gain professional resources through your membership. If you are not an ARMA member, I highly encourage you to visit arma.org to see all that ARMA has to offer. We've just had a fantastic ARMA InfoCon 2024 a few weeks ago in Houston. Comment on the chat if you were there. We'd love to know if you were there and what your experience was like. It was really great to see our fellow ARMA members and delegates in Houston. And now ARMA InfoNext 2025 is now accepting call for proposals for its upcoming event themed Bringing Maturity to Your IG program. This is your chance to share innovative ideas, practical strategies to help professionals elevate their information governance practices. If you have forward-thinking insights and expertise, we encourage you to submit your proposal. The deadline for this is October 29th, so don't miss out. We'll provide you a link in the chat so that you can click to learn more. And more exciting news, the ARMA Canada Information Conference in Montreal has a call for proposal that's now open. This is your chance to help shape the future of information governance and RIM and drive forward the evolution of best practices. Presenting at this prestigious events will enhance your professional reputation while connecting you with fellow experts and decision makers. We are seeking interactive, innovative presentations that provide practical insights participants can apply in their organization. Don't miss this opportunity to inspire change, spark advancements, and influence the future of IG. Submit your proposals by December 3rd. Click the link in the chat to learn more. So now everyone's burning question. Will today's webinar be recorded? Yes, all professional members will receive access to the recording and slides. We want to encourage you to use the Q&A feature on Zoom if you have a question. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Cadence, for providing this important educational content today. Now I have the honor of turning the webinar over to today's speakers, Tyler Anton and Sang Lee.
All right, thanks guys. Thanks Ellie for the great introduction. Hey guys, my name is Sang Lee and I'm the Manager of Technical Solutions here at Cadence. And I worked with over 20 implementation projects, whether it's integration, migration, records management, and I work more so on the technical side. And here I have my fellow colleague, Tyler, which he'll introduce himself.
Thank you, Sang. Hey everybody, my name's Tyler Anton. We are from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Would love to hear in the chat if you're more north than us. But I'm the Microsoft 365 team lead here at Cadence Solutions. So I run the portfolio of projects from a delivery side of anything Microsoft. So specifically Purview and records management, which I'm excited to get into for today. So I'll pass it back to Sang for our agenda.
All right, so today we're going to cover 5 different sections. The first, we're going to start with licensing because that is the key component that you need to understand before you start any of the Purview records management project. Afterwards, we're going to go over the planning, make sure that you have everything in place to start this project. After that, we're going to go over SharePoint best practices, since SharePoint is where you want to apply your records management for Purview records management projects. After we have all those finally kind of nailed down, we're going to go over Purview records management best practices to go over how to implement Purview. And last but not least, we're going to go over the lessons learned from all the experiences that we had with Purview records management projects. Now, that said, I'll start off with licensing first. So the key question to ask is, what Microsoft licensing do I need for effective records management? Now, that said, there's licensing requirements, differences, as well as recommendations that we're going to provide. And in terms of requirements, to automate your records management, you do require E5 license. And by automation, we're talking more so about the seamless records management, as in you guys, the end users don't really have to know the retention schedule. License is applied. Retention labels are applied based on where they are filing. So the reason why they need E5 licenses is because if you have an E3 license, basically what's going to happen is when they upload documents to a SharePoint library where there is a automated retention label applied, they're basically taking advantage of the E5 feature, meaning that it is in violations of license agreements. That's why it is mandatory to have those E5 licenses. Now, that said, just going on to the next slide here, basically the differences, I'm sure you guys heard of Office licenses and Microsoft 365 licenses. The key differences between those two licenses in terms of records management is the trainable classifiers. And that section, Tyler will cover more about trainable classifiers during the Purview records management section of this presentation. Now, our recommendation, obviously, that said, is to have that E5 licenses available within your tenant. And if you do need any kind of help, kind of asking for that E5 licenses to your IT department, let us know. We've done that before, and we can help out and make a case for that. And there are references over here that you can use. Now, that said, just one thing, quick note about this slide is that you can see there's a key difference between the E3 and the E5. E5 having a lot more features, and basically E5, if you want to even automate or default retention labels to sites, you do need that E5 licenses. And the key difference between the M365 and the O365 E5 licenses are that the M365 licenses have that trainable classifiers. But if you don't need trainable classifiers, and if you need to save some cost, O365 might be a better option for your organization. And one just last thing that I wanted to mention about licenses is Teams is now sold separately. So if you guys ever had licenses before, they will still contain Teams. But if you were to purchase new licenses, Teams are now separate from the E5, E3 licenses that you have. So if you guys do have any questions about the licensing, please post them on chat and I'll be glad to answer. And next slide. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Sang.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. So we wanted to open with licensing, and I know licensing is complicated, so put your questions in the chat. But general rule of thumb, if you're looking to have that seamless records management experience within Microsoft, to put it bluntly, it's E5 or bust. So there's ways around it, but that's the general thumb in the wind metric. So I'm going to jump into, now that we have licensing out of the way, to the meat and potatoes of today. So I'm going to talk first about proper planning. And this is for your records management projects. So before you start these projects, you should consider having the following in place. So this is what you should know before you go. First is an approved records retention schedule. It's difficult when you're implementing Purview if you don't have the backbone of an already approved records retention schedule. Maybe you have one, maybe you're still creating one. If you're in the inception stage of your records retention schedule, I'm going to give everyone a piece of homework and something that might be scary or very exciting. Open ChatGPT and ask it to create you a records retention schedule for a department in your organization, say HR, and say what sector you're in. Maybe you're a local municipality in Canada. It will reference all of the local jurisdiction and actually create one for you. Yes, you should still follow the proper approval process to make sure that you can implement it, but there are tools out there to really help this process. Secondly, as a sort of check mark, where we see success in implementing records management is organizations that also have document management policies and records management policies that encircle a full records management program. These are invaluable to lean back on when you start to make decisions related to technology. I always advise that these policies be technology agnostic, but how can we then reference them when we start to roll out Purview? Thirdly is a properly staffed records management team. This is vital in order for the long-term maintenance of this system. Again, depending on your size, it could be a person that has multiple roles, it could be one person, or it could be a whole team of people. But in order to properly classify content, accurately retain it, and defensively destroy it, you will need a proper team to help administer this system. And another thing that's nice to have is staff trained already on the records retention schedule and records management program. I see this as a nice to have because not every organization has the capacity to do this, but it's going to set yourselves up for success. If you are considering rolling out Microsoft Purview, again, when I say train staff, they don't have to have your records retention schedule memorized, but if they know what's a record, what's a non-record, and where should I save records, you are going to save a lot of headache when it starts turning into the rollout of Purview and SharePoint. All right, I'm going to touch quickly on project planning. So properly implementing records management is always more involved than anticipated. I know I might be preaching to the choir on this, but often, right, we have executives and stakeholders that need to help formulate these projects, but it's like opening Pandora's box, records management projects. So I would recommend to always ask these questions, get prepared for these scenarios before you start your projects. So one of the first questions I always ask my clients is, where are you applying retention to? It might seem simple. You might just say, oh, electronic documents. But when you open that Pandora's box of Purview, does this mean just SharePoint? But we can also do emails, OneDrive, Teams chats and channels, even Copilot prompts, and more. So if you're looking to do a full 360 of information protection, you should be asking these questions. Secondly, and one that I think is extremely important, is are we ready to have difficult conversations? Records management projects don't always, show immediate benefit like a new product or a new workflow might, but it actually might impact user experience. Users might not be able to delete, move, copy, or even edit files. It might change how they work. So executives, I think, sometimes need to be reminded of this, is that we're going to have to make some unpopular decisions perhaps during these projects. And if you prep them that these are coming, they are not going to hurt as bad when they inevitably do come. So a tip I have for you here is to educate your stakeholders on common records management implications. Can a user delete a file? Can they edit once it's marked as a record? Right? People don't think of that if it's going to impact how I work with my files. Another tip is to have a stakeholder's shoulder to lean on for unpopular decisions. Try and find somebody that is just as bought in and as passionate about records as you are. I know it's sometimes easier said than done, but if you put in this upfront effort, it's going to pay dividends when, again, inevitably, these difficult conversations happen throughout your deployments. So I hope these slides are starting to shed some light on how to set yourselves up for success. And another one to piggyback off my last slide is how to properly communicate with executives. So keep them on board with the journey, or to even maybe build this case of why we need to do this records project. You need to define a success definition. Ask yourself, what will make this records management project a success? Right? We all kind of have a general sense of what that is, but actually putting the pen on paper can be more challenging than you think. But my recommendation is to make your success definition measurable. So some common examples is maybe something like an 85% classification rate. This is usually industry standard on a well-governed system, is 85% of our files are classified properly. Maybe storage needs to decrease by 20%, or sensitive data loss incidents decrease year over year. Maybe because we are doing this records program, our insurance premiums then decrease by 15%. Again, because records management projects aren't, excuse my French, big and sexy like some other projects in your organization might be, it's important to remind everyone of the overall success. Again, maybe if we do this records program, security assessment we've passed in our industry and we're able to tap into a new market of customers. This success definition will make those difficult conversations and decisions so much easier to make because it's backed by success. So I know this is high level and consulting, but I'm dealing with a couple of clients right now that are going through this exercise 6 months into a deployment because they didn't do it first. I can't stress at how valuable this is. The next point I want to make is plan for user adoption. Although, yes, there's going to be some unpopular decisions, your framework around implementing Purview records management is to, as best as you can, adhere to the user experience. So I want to touch on what user adoption really means. It's the process by which users effectively integrate and consistently use the new system. I've bolded and underlined that because if users don't use our system of record, they save it continually on their OneDrive, their desktop, they're saving records in your non-record systems, meaning project fails. So ultimately, if users don't use our record system, you're not classifying them, you're not destroying them. So ultimately, we do need to keep in mind the user experience. So to achieve this user experience and user adoption, this is going to be my segue into my next topic, which is information architecture. So I hope section 2 gave you some takeaways to think through if you're in the planning stages of rolling out implement Microsoft Purview, or maybe you started this journey and haven't done some of those things. But now I want to double click into a bit more of the practical side. So now that you're getting ready to roll it out, let's double click into SharePoint and how we can maximize user adoption. All right. So information architecture, you've probably heard it a lot, but I want to boil it down and make it a little more simple. So information architecture, by definition, is the practice of organizing, structuring, and labeling content in an effective and scalable way. It encompasses a lot of different elements, and this can be technology agnostic, but I am going to focus on SharePoint. So it involves navigation, the search experience, taxonomy, permissions and access, who can see things, who cannot. How do I properly share and work with my colleagues? Ultimately, also governance, the big G around everything, as well as things like metadata. All of these items and more roll up into information architecture. But again, we want to design these in a way where we're keeping in mind the user experience, but also making sure our system is properly governed. So I boil this down to a common framework of 3 pillars in my implementation projects. And these, although simple, are very powerful. And what's key is balancing the 3. So the 3 are findability, usability, and governance. The first 2 are user-focused. Findability means, is it easy for me to find my files? If I am hired at one of your organizations tomorrow, is it going to take me a month of onboarding to learn how to find a record? It should be naturally intuitive. Usability, on the other side of that coin, where do I place my files? Say I'm onboarded and I'm starting to create documents and records for my organization. I need to confidently know where to put them so that they can be eventually properly classified. And third, and arguably most important for the people on this call, is the governance aspect, meaning being compliant does not impede on my user experience. So this is the framework that I want everyone to get into when we start thinking about implementing SharePoint tied to Purview records management. And this is all going to tie together by the end of our conversation today. One practical tip I like to give is the golden rule of twos. This is the standard. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions, but ideally, no more than 2 clicks to go find something. And that could mean 2 clicks to go find by search, or no more than 2 pieces of required metadata. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions to those rules, but I like to give everyone that as a standard to see if they can meet it. I've seen it done in organizations in the past to great success. All right, keeping in mind those 3 pillars of information architecture, I'm going to slow down on this slide to give you guys 3 common approaches to actually designing SharePoint. So this is more tailored to organizations that maybe aren't using SharePoint yet or are going through a cleanup. So if you already are using SharePoint, maybe this is more look at this through a cleanup lens. But information architecture is ultimately a science. What works well for some doesn't work well for others. So I'd recommend that if you are trying to plan your Purview rollout, and you're going to see why it's so important, why I'm spending so much time on SharePoint when I get to the Purview section, but I'd recommend that you try to pick one of these 3 lanes. So I'm going to go through each and try and give some practical examples of each. So the first approach to implementing SharePoint information architecture is one I call choose your own adventure. Sounds fun, right? Business units, if you're going business unit by business unit, get to define their own structure. You get to interview them, ask how they organize their content, what's going to be best for them to find their stuff. They get to be involved in how they design their SharePoint structures. Obviously, there should be some common boundaries within that so that they're still adhering to best practices, but ultimately they are in control. Pros to this is you're going to get user buy-in right away. People and organizations love it when they feel heard and they get to design what they feel is best for them. This is very flexible as well. So a modern approach. Cons, though, is it's very time consuming to do this business unit through business unit. I've seen implementations of this in an organization of around 20 departments take 3 to 4 years taking this route. Was it a success at the end? Yes, but keep in mind it will take time because every individual group will be unique. It's not standardized as well. So also if you're trying to have kind of that wrapper around control, it's going to be a little bit more challenging because people are going to want stuff structured differently. So it can be more challenging to apply governance and records management simply because everyone's doing things their own way. You can have some boundaries in place for this, but if you like this method, my advice is to plan and schedule accordingly. It always does take longer than the other 2 methods that I'm going to cover. So great and successful, but really the downside is it can take more time. The middle option is one I've called lockdown. This is where you, as maybe the record staff, maybe in combination with your IT group, whoever the stakeholders are, you come up with a strict structure that each group must follow. Now, this sometimes can vary depending on size of organization and the success of this. Maybe it works well for one group, but not for others. But this is truly where they don't get to choose how they organize their stuff. They don't know how many sites they get. They are given sites, libraries, folders, metadata, etc. This is the fastest to deploy. And I know there'll probably be some on the call, but this is great. I see often sometimes for smaller municipalities. If I'm going to use British Columbia, for example, they have something called the LGMA, which is a provincial standard for records retention schedule. If you want your structure to match your retention schedule and your organization is going to be okay with that, this lockdown approach is great. However, it does require heavy training and change management often. Again, whatever that structure is, maybe it's not tied to the retention schedule, maybe it's tied to business function and activity. Regardless, it's going to be a shift. If you're coming from file share, where people are used to organizing things as they want to, if they must adhere to a structure, they must be properly trained and warmed up to that through change management. So sometimes this can be a little bit less user-friendly, but again, the major pro to this is it's fast to deploy and you're going to have a very tight grasp on that governance. All right, we're going to get to the third, and I won't shy away from saying that this one's my favorite. It is controlled chaos. So a bit of a maybe misleading title, why it's my favorite, I'll get into, but business units must follow a common framework at a certain level, but at lower levels have more freedom. So I'll give an example that we've done in a BC municipality for this as well. So it's a bit of an adaptation off of lockdown, but basically at the site and library level, so the first two levels of navigation, those are completely locked down and tied to your records retention schedule. Users can't create a new site, they can't create a new library themselves, they would need to request one to be made simply because it's tied to records management. But beneath that, they are given the freedom and flexibility to create folders, metadata at will. We've controlled what's needed to be controlled from a records and sensitive information protection standpoint. But beneath that, they get to still leverage all of the wonderful features that Microsoft and SharePoint has: sharing, comments, versions, multiple folders, even colored folders, right? It's great. They feel in control as long as they're adhering to our top buckets. So this is still very quick to deploy. You have to spend the upfront time designing what that rigid structure is, but then give them the freedom underneath to do what they wish. So it's a compromise between standardization and freedom, and one that I find lands typically really well. There still is training and change management involved, but it's a lot easier to train people to say, if you need to file this content in only a handful of upper locations, that's easier than a very strict and rigid structure. So these are our tried and true different approaches, and you're probably thinking that there's pros and cons and maybe there's a middle ground to each of them, and there probably is. But my piece of advice that I'm going to leave you with on this topic is, from a planning perspective, try to pick one first. Maybe do a pilot. Go with one group first and see how it goes. But as you start going through each group, right, records management sometimes can be a bit unpopular. If you have what I like to call a blueprint that you're following, you're going to streamline your implementation. So my advice, pick a lane and try and stick with it. You can be flexible during it, but try and stay with your plan. All right. I know there's probably lots of questions, and I'm going to try and leave some time at the end. So write them down, put them in chat. Sang's going to try and answer them as best he can. But if you have some burning questions, just because we have so much content to cover today, I'm going to ask that we have an open Q&A at the end instead of people speaking right now. All right. So I'm going to leave this as well as a sample, right? If you're trying to come up with this structure, map it out. Use a tool, a whiteboarding tool. There's multiple out there. We use Mural. We're a great fan of Mural. Microsoft Whiteboard is one as well. There's other things out there, but start to map out your structure and start to map out elements of your information architecture like metadata. So just to walk through this structure, right at the top, you're typically going to have a hub site in your organization. That is a connector to multiple other team sites. Team sites might be siloed. Again, if you're going business unit by business unit and they are choosing their own adventure, maybe you'll have a team site per department. In this case, we have procurement. Under that, then they have different document libraries. Typically, this maps to business functions. So procurement, they have policies and procedures. They work with vendors on contracts. So then you start to map out this visual tree of your diagrams. Now, regardless of which approach you take, whether it's choose your own adventure, lockdown, or controlled chaos, I would advise you do this activity. Now, if you're doing choose your own adventure, you're going to be working with your groups to help them organize their content. With the other two approaches, you're going to want to create this diagram upfront and first. As you start to mature through this process, you can start adding things like metadata. So little tags, right? Form type equals template as a default. Form status equals drafting as a default. We want these tags to go in these locations. So these are great visualization tools to help you map out your information architecture. But again, I'm going to leave you with the golden rules of two. Ideally, no more than 2 clicks to find what you're looking for. That might mean clicking twice to get to the vendors folder, but searching from there, that's still a check mark in my book. And also no more than 2 pieces of required metadata. My biggest advice is, again, control what needs to be controlled. If users need to enter in 20 pieces of metadata just to upload a single file, they're probably going to put that file somewhere else. And that file won't be under governance. So I hope that tied the circle together back to user adoption and some practical ways that you can start thinking about your information architecture deployments. All right, so that's the SharePoint side of the records management coin. We pay so much attention to it because it's always pivotal when you start to look at Purview and how to actually apply retention to files. So that's what we're going to dive into next, is the Purview side of records management best practices. So I'm going to cover now retention application methods. So the success, again, of your Purview project is tied to your information architecture because of how Purview applies labels to content. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I always find the most successful way is when you have a sound foundation. You are really building a new home here. You want to make sure your concrete is down right before we start furnishing the house. So again, another best practice here is to standardize your retention application method. Now in Purview, there's 3 standard methods to applying labels to content. The first is manual, which I have my opinions on, and I'm sure all of you do as well, which I'll share in a moment. There's defaulted, which is a form of automated record keeping. And then there's something called auto apply, and this is specific to Purview and how you can automatically apply retention to content based on conditions. So I'm going to double click into each of these methods and talk about some of our findings in our experience. So again, we have manual classification, defaulted classification, and auto classification. With manual classification, this is where I'll get to voice my opinion, and I imagine many people in the room will agree with me. It has the lowest classification rate. It's prone to error. If you're asking users to tag content each file they upload, what's everybody going to pick? The first thing in the list, which is often O1 general. So you're going to have everything in your system be O1 general. Maybe you've experienced this in the past. Maybe this is ringing true, or maybe this is something you've learned today. Either way, it is certainly still useful in certain circumstances, in certain industries, in certain use cases, but I would always suggest to not make this your standard. What I do suggest to make your standard, where it makes sense, is defaulted classification. This, in my mind, achieves what Sang called earlier seamless records management. What is seamless records management? Let's go back to our 3 pillars of information architecture. Being compliant doesn't impede on my user experience. Records management can function without me even knowing it if I know where to place my files and find my files. That's the perfect world, right? Users use a system that's intuitive to them, but they don't even have to know that records is behind the scenes. This is as close as we can get when we start to explore defaulted classification and why I stress the importance of information architecture. I often see this yielding the highest classification rate. Again, if it's intuitive, if users know where to place their stuff, they're effectively classifying it just by putting it in the right spot. This is built straight into your information architecture. It's a one-time deployment, and I find tied to your records retention schedule and different organizations and how they work can often be used in around 80% of the use cases for retention. So to double click into this, this can be set at multiple different levels inside of SharePoint. This can be done at the document library level and at multiple folder levels. So this is where you can apply, even if you already use SharePoint, to all existing items in those libraries and or folders. So how does this map back to information architecture? Just to show you a visual, again, we're going to have a hub site at top, a team site. In this instance, imagine we're doing choose your own adventure. So we have a procurement group that has a procurement site, and they have a document library for vendor contracts. This is where, because the information architecture, we can set a default retention label, which is our little red padlock that says contracts. Let's have a contracts retention label set on this document library, meaning everything that users add to this area, folders, subfolders, however many layers deep, is always going to inherit. Same with policies and procedures, right? Everything they add into that bucket will properly inherit the correct retention. All they need to know is where to put it. That is the easiest way to achieve seamless records management. All right, but Tyler, you're probably asking me that well, how do we do something like event-based retention, right? If we're defaulting retention on folders, but maybe we need to trigger retention based on an event. I hope everyone is familiar with event-based retention, sometimes called trigger-based retention, but this is where retention needs to be triggered based on an event occurring. Maybe I win the lottery. Cadence needs to retain my employee files for 7 years post me winning the lottery and exiting the company. Maybe it's the project closure date. Maybe it's a contract sign date. It's on the event that we need to start our retention clock. This is where we recommend to solve for this using auto classification. This is great even for organizations that might have a flexible and changing information architecture. And it is ultimately best for event-based retention because we can auto apply retention based on conditions. It's more technical to deploy, and why we recommend to use it in only around 20% of your use cases when it's closely tied to event-based retention. So this is where we can, for example, apply retention based off of a piece of metadata, something like a content type, or maybe you have custom metadata for a project closure date or a project status. This is where we can create conditions to say, if project status equals closed, apply retention label and start our timer for 7 years. That is auto classification. To take this one step farther, again, if you want to reach out to us separately, I understand that this is a little bit more technical, but for some of you that will land with this example, when we manage cases, a best practice is to put them in what's called a document set. A document set inside of SharePoint is essentially a folder that has metadata that propagates to all of the items. So to close out this example of a project, maybe we have a document set, basically think fancy folder for project ABC. At that folder level, we're going to have a status for that project. If we flip that project status to closed, that piece of metadata will trickle down and inherit to every single file related to that project. Therefore, when we build an auto classification rule to say when project status equals closed, apply retention, it's going to automatically apply retention to all of that information. So that's a one-time action from a user that's not related to your records retention schedule. They just need to track what the status of their project is. That is so much more user-friendly than a user memorizing your records retention schedule, emailing the records manager when an event has occurred so that records manager can apply retention. Again, tying back to user adoption, if you can tie in that user adoption and experience, you can blend it with Purview records management and make it a seamless experience for your users. So if you're ever interested in a demo of what this looks like, reach out to Sang and I. We're happy. We give them all the time. It's not, unfortunately, a part of today's agenda just because we got so much other good stuff to cover, but I hope that closes the loop on auto classification. Auto classification as well can be triggered based off of many different conditions. It doesn't just have to be a single column. It can be multiple column types. If it's a date field, a managed metadata property, a free-form text, it all works. One thing that is important to call out though is that an auto apply policy will never overwrite a defaulted classification. So what that means is, again, back to information architecture, you really have to be careful on how you're segmenting your structure, because we can't have conflicts between defaulted and auto classified. All right, another cool thing I'll call out about auto labeling is that it can do more than just metadata. You can also trigger this if if documents contain sensitive information in your organization. So this is if maybe you have credit card numbers, social insurance information, that can be automatically detected through Microsoft Purview. Also, it can leverage what's called a trainable classifier. Sang mentioned this earlier. This is a callback that a trainable classifier does require the Microsoft 365 E5 feature, but this is where Microsoft has pre-built models that can help auto-detect types of documents. So not sensitive information within them, but an invoice as a whole, a contract as a whole, a resume as a whole. In my professional opinion, this is a cool feature, but difficult to deploy and only gives maybe a 60% classification rate. So if you're a really large organization though, where thousands of SharePoint sites and getting a grasp on information architecture is far out of your reach, trainable classifiers might be your answer. But content that contains specific words, phrases, or properties like metadata that we've already discussed is also totally possible with auto apply. So again, we have our three: manual classification, defaulted classification, and auto classification. Best practice, in Sang's and I's storied career of implementing Purview records management and just records management technology agnostic is defaulted classification is your best recipe for success, with combination of auto classification for event-based retention so that you have that full 360 of your retention schedule covered. All right, so I hope that connected the dots between information architecture and the Purview side of things on how retention is applied to files. But what I'm going to cover now is some things that, again, you can take away to start planning for your Purview records management projects. So these things are important to start work on now. You don't need to wait to do some of these things. And the first is making your records retention schedule electronic ready. What do I mean by electronic ready? Typically, we have a PDF version of a records retention schedule, but it doesn't necessarily translate to the requirements that Purview needs to translate the two. So one of the most important things is what starts the retention clock. Often I see retention schedules will have codes, current year plus 7, right? So based off of the current year, we need to keep it for 7 years. But in Purview, these are the only 3 features that we have available to us. Does it start on modified date, created date, or an event? And when I say event, that's again back to auto apply. So modified date is great because that kind of touches on the concept of an inactive record. If something is not modified for 7 years, that might meet your condition of your retention schedule for CY plus 6, for example. Created date as well as straightforward. If a user continues to modify that file, that retention timer will continue to reset. So this is where you could start today to go through your records retention schedule. And if this information isn't in there, you're going to need to make this distinction before you implement Microsoft Purview. Now, another one is retention behavior. This goes back to one of my earlier points of a difficult conversation. When I say retain or delete, this is around if a user tries to delete a file, what happens? Should they be prevented? Should they be allowed to delete files? I've yet to met more than maybe a very small handful of organizations that knew the answer to this question before we actually started their Purview records management project. Is something tagged as a record? It seems, but if we're defaulting on a lot of content, should users have the ability to delete or not? And then end of life actions as well. Are we going to auto delete the content, go through a disposition approval process, move or archive? Sometimes this is more well-defined in a records retention schedule, but you have to think about it from a records lens, or sorry, from a Purview lens. When we're actually applying this to content in SharePoint, what does this look like? So those are my 3 takeaways I'd say for everybody that's looking to get started on this journey is take a look at your records retention schedule and start doing this mapping to the Purview electronic ready format. Consider what starts the retention clock, how can users interact with these files once they're tagged, and what happens at the end of their life. Those are 3 key pieces. All right, another piece of homework is to define a standard disposition approval process. Maybe you have this, maybe you don't, but who needs to have eyes on records before they're ultimately disposed of? Having these conversations before you start your project can certainly happen, and it's very valuable to do so. Also, to determine what is required in your destruction logs. Microsoft Purview does generate destruction logs out of the box, but maybe you have specific requirements. This is where if you do have specific requirements, you might need to extend Microsoft Purview a little bit. We've done this for many of our customers in the past where we have done custom reporting solutions for destruction logs. Out of the box, Purview will give you the name of the file, the location of the file, and who approved it for disposal, but it doesn't contain a lot of other information outside of those things. So if you need more than that, you'll probably want to start thinking and documenting what that is, so that by the time you are ready to roll out Purview, you know what you're getting. So those are my takeaways. I hope that these are things that you guys can start to think about. All right, I'm going to close now on some lessons learned and just to kind of connect the dots between everything we've talked about today and try and leave the last 10 minutes or so for questions. All right, so these have been created from Sang and I through countless implementations, and we've tried to simplify them as much as possible, and I'll really talk through each of them. So the first one ties back to the earlier half of our presentation. Make a success definition and reference it for decision making. I don't know if many of you have heard of what's called an impact and effort matrix, but think of a simple chart with 2 axes. On one, it's impact, and then the other is effort. Plotting decisions on an impact effort matrix is really valuable when you have a success definition, right? If you need to go through a re-cleanup of all of your SharePoint sites, that's obviously high effort, but maybe depending on your success definition, that's not high impact. So using those tools and your success definition is ultimately going to help you make decisions faster and potentially unpopular ones as you progress through your project. So this one is our first lesson. Second is to prioritize user experience. I hope that was made clear today through the 3 pillars of information architecture. Again, those are findability, usability, and governance. And the reason why it's so important, again, simply is if a user doesn't consistently use your record system, you're not managing records. So ultimately, regardless of your success definition, if they're not using it, your project is most likely going to fail. So although yes, records management inevitably may impact your user experience, try to minimize it as much as possible. Use something like an auto apply policy where users only have to change metadata once to trigger an event instead of memorizing your records retention schedule. They know where to put things and know where to find things. You'll probably get 85% of the way there. Third is choose an information architecture approach early, and again, do a pilot if necessary. Again, those 3 approaches being choose your own adventure, lockdown, or controlled chaos. Again, if you're not believing me yet, do a pilot. Go through the activity with one group. Choose a group that's not the easiest, is actually what I would recommend. One that has complicated records. Maybe one that's slightly resistant to change, but at least at the end of the day, you can make a champion of change out of. This will shed light on if this approach is valuable and also shed light on the value of choosing and sticking with an approach. Again, I've gone through countless projects where organizations have taken the thought process of, we'll kind of take it in stride and see how users react. But without that approach to follow, things can derail quite quickly. The 4th lessons learned, only control what needs to be controlled. Again, this can be kind of hard to visualize and take a grasp on, but I like the example of controlled chaos as an approach for this is, again, control what you need to ensure that records management works properly and information protection works properly. Outside of that, the more you handcuff users, again, the less they're going to like your system, and then you're going to run at risk of not having good user adoption. So again, I am always on the side of we need to make that balance between achieving our success definition by controlling what we need to, but still giving users the freedom and flexibility. If you have a lockdown library that retention's defaulted on, and that's correct, but they have 25 nested folders in there, I would argue that that's fine. So I know maybe a little radical to think like that, but again, ask yourself, only control what needs to be controlled for records purposes. Lesson 5 is make a blueprint as you go. So similar to the approach, as you start to go through each of the groups, maybe you're doing all at once, maybe you're doing department by department, however you're doing the actual rollout, is when these record scenarios inevitably come up, right? Can a user delete a working file? How do we trigger event-based retention for a superseded example? How do we deal with superseded policies? Document those decisions as a blueprint. If they come up for one group, they're definitely going to come up with another one. Because the nuances of records management are so detailed and in the weeds of how users interact with your system, if you don't document, you might forget. So make that blueprint. By the time you hit your 8th department, you're going to be flying through them simply because you can reference your blueprint. Oh, they deal with superseded records. This is how we do it. And you go forward. So definitely very valuable to make what's called a blueprint. All right, the 6th one is try to reduce the complexity of your records retention schedule when converting it to be electronic ready. I know some of you won't have this luxury if you are highly regulated, maybe it's coming from your state or province, but you will have some flexibility when it comes to adapting it to Purview and SharePoint. What I see a direct correlation in every single project is the complexity of the records retention schedule to the duration and effort of the implementation project. If you can minimize the amount of retention labels that you need, or reduce the amount of event-based retention scenarios, you are ultimately going to get to the finish line much faster and most likely achieve your success definition. If you can argue and defensively classify 80% of content and reduce the amount of event-based retention scenarios and meet, again, defensible destruction, you're going to reach that finish line much more faster and with probably a few less bruises along the way. Lastly, it's don't set it and forget it. So what I mean by this is once you've gone through the journey of implementing Purview records management, continue those best practices, have active disposition review cycles, have people monitor your system to make sure people aren't changing retention, have a process if people need to create new sites, libraries, and folders. Be able to support your record system. Otherwise, you're probably going to slip off and lose some of the success that you realized upon finishing your project. So back to that very first slide of know before you go, of have proper policies, have the proper team in place. Those are crucial to ensure your success post-implementation. So those are our top 7. I hope they've resonated with some of you. I know we're getting close to some burning question time. So what I'm going to do now is just really transition quickly to a couple self-promotion slides about Cadence. Sang and I, we're delivery guys, we're not sales guys, but I'm going to talk about us just for a little bit here. So here at Cadence, again, we're from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. We are a partner with Microsoft. So we're one of, I think, 20 hand-selected partners globally that specialize in content management and information governance. So we specialize in the Purview stack, as well as Copilot, SharePoint Online, and what's called SharePoint Premium. So there's a lot of other features that really help improve content management, records management, and data governance amongst these 3 or 4 platforms in Microsoft. And we're definitely an industry leader in this space. The part of the services that we provide kind of go through the full menu. We have advisory services. Maybe after today, you've realized, hey, I'm not ready to get technical yet. We need to develop a strategy. We can help your organization develop what we call a playbook, which is a tailored, almost roadmap, if you will, of how to get ready to implement. But we also have the full technical horsepower to do end-to-end system implementations like I talked about today. And migrations as well. Often all of our projects we're migrating from either one ECM into SharePoint or perhaps a file share into SharePoint, whatever source system into SharePoint Online for the purposes of records management and data governance. We can help you through that journey. As well as we do offer managed and hosted services as well if you need that phone a friend for Microsoft. Lastly, I'm going to do a quick shout out to our training program. I help lead that program. If some of you have taken it before, happy to see you here again. But we provide hands-on practical training for these 3 modules in Microsoft Purview: records management, e-discovery, and data loss prevention. They are often 2 half-day courses, maybe 3 for some, but this is where we double click into the technology and go through hands-on scenario-based examples of how you can actually implement this and do this in your own organizations. All right, so there's my plug. Back to, can you have a copy of the recording? Absolutely. Are you going to get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. But I wanted to leave the rest now for questions. We got about 8 minutes or so. I'm not sure. I'm going to look to some of the moderators as well to see if people are able to come off mute, or maybe saying you want to highlight a couple key ones that were asked in chat.
Yeah, so basically there's a lot of questions being asked. There's 11 open right now, 22 answered. So let's just go over the open questions and go on from there. So the first question is from Curtis Nash. Do you have any insights on to using folders versus document sets to organize records? Is one better with Purview and one better without Purview, just in SharePoint Online?
Great question. Document sets for case management. So your employees, your projects, your contracts. If you want to do automated event-based retention, go with a document set. Outside of that, I would actually advise to not use them. Folders are great. Maybe that's going to be polarizing to some, but right, if you are controlling what needs to be controlled, which is maybe just at that doc set level, let users use folders. So that's my take, at least on that.
Perfect. All right, the next one is from Gift. What is the difference between creation date and modify date?
Great question. So that's on a file. So when you create a file, upload it, think drag and drop. That's the timestamp that that file is created. So you could, excuse me, trigger retention based off when the item was created. Modified date is when you continue to edit a file. It's going to update that date and time every time you edit it. So if I edit it tomorrow and we need to keep it 7 years after I edit it, if I edit it 2 weeks from now, that's going to restart that 7-year timer.
And kind of related to that question, Rataz asked, we have only 3 trigger: modification date, creation date, and event. What does event mean here?
Event is basically what I was referring to for auto apply policies. So the event is a little more flexible. It can be triggered based off of many number of things: metadata, keywords, maybe even a trainable classifiers. That point was to say that you can solve for event-based retention in your systems.
Right. The next question is from Amanda. If you do choose to have disposition approvals, is this done as retention runs up on an item real time, or can you schedule disposition reviews to occur annually?
It's a great question, and it is real time. So it's basically a floating list where items become eligible for destruction. They'll be populated in a list. Microsoft Purview has an out-of-the-box disposition approval process where you'll have the ability to review the content of the item, approve it for disposal, reject it, extend it, relabel it, or send it to somebody else for approval. So that is the out-of-box process. You could then, to extend on this, is you could only look at that list once a year. That's how I typically advise that process to work.
Right. The next question is from Alexia. How long does it take for the labels to appear on records? Is it instant?
For auto apply, great question. It's up to 7 days, unfortunately. That is a Microsoft cloud. I'm trying to find a better word than limitation. It's just the reality of Microsoft and how their publishing mechanisms work. So it's up to 7 days. Typically, it runs over a weekend, so it's not instant.
This is from an anonymous attendee. So are organizations setting up teams, channels, document libraries with records management functionality so that users can edit document as in create versions, even though a retention label has been applied?
Typically, I see more organizations trending to in-place records management and then triggering retention based off modified date. So they're allowed to continually work on their documents, right? We don't want to impede on their user experience. But if your retention schedule is driven off of inactivity, modified date is a great thing. If someone doesn't modify it for 7 years, that's going to meet that retention condition, then dispose it after that's been in an active record for 7 years.
All right. The next question is from Susan. She asked, it would be great to see a demonstration of Purview. And in order for you, if you want to see it, please reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to show you a demo.
Yeah, we have our website's great. There's past webinars where we've given demos. Typically, we do demos on webinars, Sang and I, but this one has been a little bit more theory. We have a YouTube channel that does M365 Minute. And then for this, I would also highly always recommend our training.
Perfect. All right. The next question. How would you recommend handling a retention schedule where legal and operational requirements have resulted in a lot of event-based retentions?
Use maybe a lot of document sets. That's a tricky question to answer. If your retention schedule is what it is, then you just need to plan your information architecture appropriately. Lots of organizations do have a lot of event-based retention. It just takes a little bit more planning. So just something to be aware of. I'm not going to recommend that you go fight the good fight of changing your retention schedule. I understand that's a slippery slope, but just making sure that you have the tools in your toolkit to manage event-based retention is what's going to be important.
All right. The next question is it possible to review a label in place?
Yes, absolutely. Files don't need to move. They'll show up in place. And if you're assigned the correct role, you'll be able to review it in Purview, which is a central solution.
Perfect. Okay. So one other question for Melissa is why Purview over Laserfish?
Yeah, good question. I don't have the feature list in front of me, but the best answer to this that I like to give is that Microsoft, you're probably already using day-to-day. Teams, OneDrive, I almost guarantee everyone here is using Outlook, right? It's a unified approach to data governance. Microsoft even themselves could be a bit biased, released a security index, a study that says the organizations that best manage their information have the fewest systems. So by consolidating down to Microsoft's technology. That is typically the direction that we see organizations going. Also, there's a licensing thing. You might already be paying for E5. You might not know it. That's a beauty too, right? You could already have all these features available to you, so you can have that cost savings by getting rid of those other ECMs and just rolling and consolidating into Microsoft.
And just one thing to add, if you guys are using Teams, the backend of where documents are being stored in Teams is actually SharePoint Online. So potentially you might be able to kind of leverage that to, you know, if you guys share documents a lot, Purview has that benefit as well.
Yeah, you're probably already using Microsoft. I guarantee everyone's using Microsoft one way or another. All 280 of you that were here today. So,
All right. Next question from Derek. For the Purview Records Management training, what is the 2025 schedule of sessions?
TBD, great question. We're working on it. It's going to be out soon.
Perfect.
It's on our website. We'll get it out there right away.
So Melissa asks, can you manage physical records with Purview? Paper documents, boxes?
Great question. So unfortunately, this is not currently a feature of Microsoft Purview. So not to say that it won't be. Microsoft is always looking out there at competitors and trying to, lack of better words, gobble them up and make it into their own feature set. Now, we've done for other clients in the past some more custom solutions to do physical records in Microsoft. So it's possible. It's just not out of the box.
Next question from an anonymous attendee. With a mix of various records types and files with different retention periods stored in common locations and repositories, what would be the best approach for applying auto deletion?
It's a great question. First, I would recommend to get a grasp of what records live where. You might have to do a bit of a data inventory. And then you can start looking through the multiple application methods. It might make sense to do an auto apply based off a keyword. Maybe there's different metadata in those locations to help with that process. I'm not necessarily saying you'll need to go full cleanup, but do that data inventory. That'll tell you where records live and that'll give you some light.
Next one is, how do you handle the preservation site where documents are stored after deletion in Purview? Should the preserved copies be deleted intermittently?
That one we might have to answer offline just because I think we're at time.
And there are additional questions. We will get back to them after this webinar.
Fantastic. We'll wrap up. Wow, that was jam full of goodies. A really great session. I'm hearing a lot of positive comments and I'm seeing reactions. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. And again, thank you to our speakers for bringing us this excellent session. And we hope to see everyone at another ARMA webinar soon. As a quick reminder, access to the recording and slides will be sent in a follow-up email. If you have additional questions, please email us at armaservice@arma.org. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.